Hey everyone, my name is Peter Zaitsev and I am founder at Percona, and today we are going to talk about trends with databases, with particular focus on open source databases. In the first part of our presentation, we'll talk about the innovation which has been happening in the last few years. The first very important topic is what we are moving from a single node databases, like think MySQL, Postgres, to many of distributed databases, which are designed from the ground up to be distributed, right? That's you can think about ScyllaDB, Cassandra, MongoDB, new SQL databases like Yugabyte or CockroachDB are all designed to be distributed at heart. The other interesting trend, I think, is separation of storage and compute, which is coming to us from the analytical databases. Think Snowflake as a great example. But now I see even some operational databases like Neon is building on this new idea of separation, storage, and compute. We also have a rise of serverless databases. Well, of course, a serverless of databases in particular means there are still servers which run the database technologies, but as a user, you don't think about provisioning database servers or instances. You are just thinking in terms of what kind of capacity and performance I am buying, which is much more friendly. We also see over the last few years a lot of different database models have came to existence. I remember when I was getting in the database ecosystem in the late 90s, SQL or relational database was pretty much it. Vast majority dominating. And SQL and relational database are still very popular, but we also have a lot of general purpose databases, time series databases, graph databases, document, data structures, and so on and so forth, right? A database particularly built for specific purpose. Even more so, we have a trend of some databases becoming multimodal databases. So single database can support multiple data models and often support different language or protocols. We also see as a part of this is some form of emulation, where newcomers to the market, we use some popular languages and protocols to simplify adoption. For example, if you look at a ClickHouse, it can speak both PostgreSQL and MySQL protocols. Victoria Metrics has InfluxDB and Graphite API. FerretDB uses MongoDB front end, right, to replace MongoDB applications with PostgreSQL backend. Another Postgres solution, Babelfish, allows you to talk to PostgreSQL as if it were Microsoft SQL comparable database, right? So there's a lot of those solutions in their industry. Now, if you think about the open source, what is the biggest factor impacting open source right now, and has been for the last few years, perhaps 5 or more years? And it is the cloud. Because cloud changes a lot in terms of how open source is adopted, monetized, and so on and so forth. And in database space in particular, we can see this interesting outcome. For a number of years, we had a databases of years by DB Engines technology, were open source databases, right? And DB Engines rating manages databases by, in this case, by how much growth they're getting. And this year, or actually, well, 2021, it was their Snowflake, with very much proprietary cloud-based database. So really, cloud impacts our ecosystem a lot. Now, how does cloud impact an open source and database in particular? One, it really allows to maximize and simplify adoption. Because in the cloud, it's actually all the databases are easy, right? Wherever complicated setup you need to do, wherever that can be simplified by the cloud vendors, so you can deploy the most complicated database in a couple of clicks. At the same time, it changes opportunities for monetization, right? And now that is where a lot of conflicts with the cloud and open source, I think, develops. In this case, I want to remember the words of Martin Mikus, who was a CEO of MySQL AB when I was there, who was always saying to us what, hey, open source is not a business model. You can think about open source as development model, right? Even maybe marketing model. But you know what? Open source itself is not a business model, and it can support many different business models, right? And obviously, cloud changes a lot in this regard. For example, for MySQL in particular, the big impact of a cloud was what cloud allows you to hijack GPL, right? If you're not trying in the cloud, you could say, hey, if you are modifying my software and making commercial version of that, well, you cannot use that with GPL license. You have to buy the enterprise license. And MySQL used to make a lot of money this way, but guess what? It doesn't work in the cloud, and Amazon can modify MySQL with Amazon Aurora, right, and monetize it without paying to Oracle anything for that. This is why, especially in the cloud, it's important to understand how the open source project you are talking about is owned and governed, right? And in this case, I want to separate open source in two different buckets. One is community-driven, foundation, multiple vendors, like some ecosystem based, right? And then there is single vendor driven. And that is where reality of a cloud is quite different. If you think about foundation-based open source, they're very much focused on cloud helps to accelerate adoption. And yes, cloud changes who captures the value, but you know what? As long as the ecosystem is strong, the foundation is stronger, right? And we can see this very well with PostgreSQL as an example. PostgreSQL folks really love what the cloud really helped for PostgreSQL to become that arguably #1 open source database has become in the last few years. And yes, top dogs in the PostgreSQL ecosystem is no more Enterprise DB, but the folks as Amazon, Microsoft, Google, sort of our usual suspects, but ecosystem itself is a very strong and flourishing. Now, if you think about the single vendor open source, which tend to be venture funded or public companies, they are really focused on maximizing for and making that particular vendor successful. So they really fearful of a competition with the cloud vendors, because guess what? If cloud vendor makes money instead of them making money, that is not good for them and their investors. And that has caused a lot of those folks fully or partly actually abandoning open source licenses, right? And this is just like an incomplete list of those vendors. Now, what is interesting in this case is what exactly is a primary goal of that license change? Well, is creating monopoly on database as a service market, right? Those folks, they say, well, you know what? If you just want to run a software yourself, maybe serve some services to your customers based on our open source software, it doesn't matter, right? Well, not open source, but our source available software. It doesn't matter, but if you really want to build database as a service, that is going to be a problem. They're not going to allow us according to the new license terms. So what is the deal with database as a service? Why there is so much focus on that? Well, it really provides you state-of-art simplicity, right? That allows you application developers to focus on the application and not about that messy and complicated database kitchen, which is actually requires very different skills what application developments often have, right? It allows a high level of automation as well. So what does that mean? The problem is with that monopoly on database as a service market. Well, I think that really makes software not any different from proprietary software, because using database as a service is very different skill compared to rolling your own database setup and maintaining that, right? And that means many of those companies just have no practical alternative, because they cannot just implement it in-house if they if they choose to. But in this regard, I think not all is lost, and I think actually we have seen something similar to that before, right? I think the open source software tends to be slow but inevitable, right? It doesn't have such a large budgets and moves so quickly in innovation as some focused proprietary companies can, right? So, for example, in early 2000s, I remember we had this very polished Microsoft ASP.NET, and I remember folks would laugh at us, open source dude, who would use VI to code something in Perl and PHP. But well, if you think about now, we have a fantastic tools for development ecosystem which are completely open source. Now, though, we have in the cloud vendors like Amazon provides us a very good and polished cloud experience, which is kind of a lot more polished than the one of what the open source ecosystem provides. Another example, of course, would be something like Solaris versus Linux. I remember when I started in this ecosystem, there have been a lot of people using Solaris and laughing at Linux. When I started with Linux, it was 32-bit operating system and didn't handle multiple CPUs completely. You couldn't even create file more than 2 gigabytes inside. It was a joke. Well, and where is that joke now compared to Solaris? So I believe that is what is happening with open source right now, right, and is going to continue happen. What open source catches up and will continue to catch up, and I think a lot of innovation in this case comes from the cloud native computing foundation and Kubernetes, right? So what does that allow us all to do? Well, I think if you look at the cloud, you can really look at the cloud at two different ways. One is cloud as commodity. You know, like think about like internet. There is a lot of providers offer internet out there, but you know what? There is a pretty much no difference which one you use, right? The same happens with the cloud right now with its infrastructure services, like network, like storage, like compute. They're pretty much all the same. Different price, different quality, but they are the solid building blocks. And then there are those highly differentiated services, right, which are proprietary and which create lock-in. And I believe if open source, we can let the cloud to be that commodity infrastructure provider where we can create most of the value through the open source software. What is interesting in this regard, Amazon tends to agree with me. That image is actually from Amazon presentation from, decade or more ago when they compare cloud computing to electricity services. And guess what? Electricity services is commodity. You can buy electricity from any provider, and you know what? Your fridge, your TV will continue to work. You don't have to change any of your house appliances if you happen to change the electricity provider. Well, with that a little bit of philosophical discussion, let's talk if we do have open source database as a service implementation in the ecosystem. Well, and as I know, not really. Not yet, but we have taken the baby steps and we do have a very solid foundation. What is that foundation? The first one is Kubernetes, which is a foundation of that cloud-native ecosystem I mentioned. And the thing about the Kubernetes is not so much what this is amazing piece of software, right? Well, but the main thing is what that is universally available and has such a huge community and a mind share behind it, right? Kubernetes is available at any public cloud vendors worldwide. It's available for private cloud providers. Think like VMware, OpenStack, right? You can use run Kubernetes on all of those environments, right? And Kubernetes, while it started with focus on stateless application, it's getting better and better for stateful applications as well. And most open source databases now have a Kubernetes operators available, so you can run those operators out there. So why Kubernetes operators are important, and how they are different, let's say, from a bunch of Ansible or Terraform scripts you may have already to deploy your databases? Well, the thing of databases is day one is really only tip of the iceberg. Most complexity comes from a day two operations, because guess what? When you put the database in production, it likely needs to operate for decades. It needs to be up most of the time in many cases, right? Or at least all the time, having like a no downtime, right? Or if a downtime has to be taken, that has significant business costs, right? And you cannot lose any data, right? That is why those day two is very important. And the Kubernetes really allows you to have a very robust day two automation, much better than many other frameworks, right? And database as a service can be built on Kubernetes. Kubernetes can be this foundation, and Kubernetes operators can be fantastic building block. Some people may say, well, you know what, we heard what running our database on Kubernetes is impossible, bad, and so on and so forth. But reality is, if you look at majority of database as a service solutions, which has been built over last few years, we actually use Kubernetes underneath, right? Here are some of examples of folks who mentioned to me or stated publicly what they are using Kubernetes operators. So if you think about that, whether you believe in database on Kubernetes or not, there are hundreds of thousands of database instances are constantly running on Kubernetes, right? And quite successfully, right? Because we don't hear, too much of, oh my gosh, it's all crash and burn, right? By folks using those solutions. If you look at Percona, we are actually one of the companies which are building an open source database as a service solution as a feature of our Percona monitoring and management project, right? And we expect to be one of any, right? As it often happens with open source first, you see the proprietary technologies come to market, they figure out what has to be built, how exactly it has to look, how it should be marketed, and then the open source comes in and democratizes, if you will, right, makes it more available, low-cost solutions to the market. And I think that will be happening in this case as well. Our solution is still a work in progress in beta. If you want to try it out, give us some feedback, or even contribute some code, you can, and you're welcome to do so. That is the power of open source software comes from. And that's all I had to say for today. Let's keep each other in touch and enjoy the rest of the conference.